He's a man whose comments often hit the headlines, and mostly just because people are surprised that someone of his stature is speaking out and speaking out so boldly. I'm talking about an industrialist who epitomizes Atmanirbhar Bharat long before the slogan was coined and doesn't pull his punches when criticizing government policy. I'm pleased to welcome to the show today Rajiv Bajaj. Mr. Bajaj, thank you for speaking with us. This has been a long-term time coming. Great to have you on the channel today. And just want to start by getting your thoughts because we're speaking, at the beginning of Unlock 1.0. A lot of offices are back today. People have started going back to work in bits and pieces. What is your take on how we stand and where we stand?
Well, Tamanna, first of all, I'm glad you invited me, and I'm pleased with your choice of words when you say he's a critic of government policy, because people seem to think I'm a critic of the government. I am not a political animal. I am not a critic of the government or of anybody in government. But yes, if there is a policy or the other, which in my view is inimical to my industry or my business or my employees, then I think it's my responsibility to speak about it, and that's all I do. So let's move on to Unlock 1. And I think currently the process of unlocking is a little stop and start, a little erratic, a little haphazard. It gets better with every day. But even now, the fundamental issue is this, to my mind, that the lesser problem around us is the flu virus. The bigger problem around us is the fear virus. For about 10 weeks, people have been repeatedly told that we are in the midst of a very dangerous situation from which there is almost no escape unless you hide at home. And this is proving to be a big hurdle in re-establishing smooth operations, because in every locality, at least where I live in Pune, and what I know of my plants in Pune and Aurangabad, everybody is taking it upon himself to be the custodian of everyone around him. And this is not allowing things to start up as smoothly as perhaps the government intends for it to be. From my point of view, I would make two simple points. One, I would say I continue to be perplexed by why we have a curfew from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. All of us can go to office from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening, but a few of us cannot move around at night after 9 o'clock. This makes no sense to me. And it really affects plants like ours that need to operate in the second shift to be able to produce at some reasonable capacity. Because just in the first shift with distancing, it is impossible. So I don't understand why people should feel offended. And, and this is what I say to people, that I have absolutely no cause to believe that what I'm saying is being misunderstood. Sure, sometimes on a matter like this, I may have a different point of view, and I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I have a right to ask some questions, and that's all I've done. The short answer is no one has, taken umbrage to it. Nobody has called me and, been mean to me. On the contrary, for example, I can share with you that very early in the lockdown, I would say sometime towards the middle of April, post a couple of my interviews, a very senior minister called me from Mumbai, and he said to me that the Prime Minister has watched your interviews, and I have been asked to let you know that he appreciates your point of view. I always tell people, for example, when my quadricycle was stuck for 10 years, thanks to let's say some tactics by some of my competition, 8 of those 10 years were during the UPA. It is in fact with the NDA government and with the support of people like Mr. Amitabh Kant and Shri Nitin Gadkari that I actually got permission for Bajaj to launch the quadricycle. So, sometimes people see ghosts that don't exist. I don't see them.
So, do you think that there is an unreasonable sort of hesitation when your peers don't speak out? I mean, Indian industry is notorious for being very politically correct and saying even lesser than they perhaps should.
Well, I guess it's a case of to each his own, I mean, some people are comfortable speaking up and some people are not. And I think they are both right. One should do what one is comfortable doing. People, on the other hand, also speak up on a lot of other issues, a lot of other, let's say, political issues. And I don't care to speak up on that. And I don't think I owe anybody an explanation for that. But I will say this, that when people in business, when people in entertainment, when people in sport, when other people, prominent people in other walks of life can say so much about a poor elephant that died, surely they can say a few things about millions of people who walked home.
Wow. Mr. Bajaj, I want to come to the question of the lockdown. You've been unequivocal in your view that we started the lockdown too early and it went on for too long. You've called it a draconian lockdown, and now we are opening up when infections were high. I want to turn around and ask you, what do you think should have been done differently? Remember when the lockdown was put in place in late March 24 to be precise, we still didn't know what coronavirus is going to look like. Now, about 70 odd days later, we're looking at a large number of cases in India, but relatively fewer deaths. Would you concede that's because of a stringent lockdown that went on for so long?
You're asking me this question after I read in the papers today that our previous Chief Minister, Mr. Fadnavis, said that my view on this doesn't count because I'm not an expert. And, frankly, I have to say he's right. I am not an expert. And if I might take a shot back at him, I would say, sir, and I've met Devendraji a number of times. He's a very fine gentleman and a very fine politician. And I would say to him, yes, I'm not an expert, which is why I don't think that, lockdown karke, thali baja ke, diya jala ke, aur phool barsa ke, corona dur hota hai. But more seriously, I don't necessarily have answers, but I do have some thoughts or some questions. Number one, I do not understand why we looked west when we should have looked east, because we are an Asian country with Asian levels of immunity, temperature, demography in terms of young population, perhaps a resistance to thrombosis, which is important in the context of this virus, etc. So first of all, I want the government to explain to me, if they would care to, why is it that they looked west? Number two, I do not understand completely why those who are in the age group of 21 to 60, which is largely the working population, those of them that are healthy and robust, why were they kept at home and not allowed to go to work, wearing a mask, keeping a distance? Why were they not allowed to go to work? What is the data based on which we put everybody inside and virtually ground the wheels of the economy to a halt? This I don't understand. Number three, I don't at this moment buy the argument that this early and hard lockdown has limited infections or deaths in India, quite simply because look at what's happening in Japan. Japan is a graying society, and to the best of my knowledge, there are fewer than 1,000 deaths in Japan. Look at Thailand, a society in which, quote unquote, everybody mixes with everyone. To the best of my knowledge, they have like 100 or 200 deaths. Maybe it's double digit also, I'm not sure. Look at a small country like Cambodia, 5 or 10 deaths, Singapore, etc. So my point is that most Asian countries have reported very low infections and very low deaths as compared to the West. And I don't think it's the reflected glory of the Indian lockdown. It's because Asian countries or Asian population, for whatever reason, are behaving differently. And finally, my quarrel with the logic of the lockdown is that it was ostensibly done to flatten the curve so that the medical infrastructure could catch up. The math will never add up on that. in 1.4 billion people, if you take 10% who are elderly, 10% who are hypertensive, 10% who are diabetic, so on and so forth, you're talking of 300-400 million people. There is no way to flatten that curve. Even if you were to lock down for a year, you would need a capacity of 5 or 10 million beds, ventilators with the nurses and doctors to be able to deal with that kind of a population. So the math just doesn't add up there. These are, I think, 4 fundamental reasons why, I don't understand the motive behind the lockdown.
Just as a counter example, and you're right, you are simply putting your opinion out there. It's for policymakers to figure out how to do. And I don't think there is any way for anyone to know what is right or wrong. For example, let's take a country like Sweden, lauded by everyone for not imposing any lockdown. Now they're sitting and questioning each other because they have some of the highest mortality rates in the world. This is an unprecedented situation. Forget about any government because, you really can't put yourself in that position. But if I ask you, Mr. Bajaj, if you had no restrictions and you go back to the month of March, would you have done things differently in terms of how, you let your employees come into work or kept them at home, or, how you managed your business, or even your family, how often they went out and exposed themselves or not?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Sweden because I think this example is either misunderstood or it is widely misquoted. Sweden did not continue business as usual. Sweden advocated hygiene, masks, distancing, and particularly that one take care of the elderly and the immunocompromised. They did all of that. What they did not do is to go and lock up everybody else that was young and healthy, irrespective of taking all these precautions. So Sweden did not go from one extreme of business as usual to the other extreme. Sweden found the middle path in doing this. And we have to wait to see how the data matures out of Sweden, because as the Swedish chief scientist has said, sure, today, the death rate in Sweden is higher than that of our Scandinavian neighbors who locked up harder than we did. But let's watch what happens in 6 to 12 months' time when they have opened up. Let's watch how they catch up. Because he made a very chilling statement. He said the hallmark of this pandemic is that the healthy and the young are silently waiting to infect the old and the vulnerable, which means that the virus is always going to be around waiting for you to unlock. And this is exactly what has happened in India, that as we are unlocking and beginning to meet each other, and also as we are testing more, the cases are going up. So what would I have done differently? Fundamentally, I would have exercised all these precautions in terms of the mask, the distancing and stuff like that. Keep the elderly and immunocompromised away, safe. But I would have said to everyone else, get on with your work. Now, one of the arguments made against that, for example, is that people live with the elderly or with the unwell, and how will they manage it? I think we have to grant people that they have the sense to make those choices for themselves. I mean, don't you and I have the choice to decide whether, rightly or wrongly, whether or not we want to smoke? We have that right, knowing fully well that smoking kills. It says so on the packet of cigarettes. People, unfortunately, exercise the choice not to wear their seat belt or not to wear their helmet. That doesn't mean you shut down Bajaj Auto because riding a two-wheeler is not safe. So we have to leave it to people to make that final choice in the final mile and not micromanage their lives. That's my point.
Okay, let me come, since you brought up Bajaj Auto, let me come to, that very important part of, why we were keen to talk to you as well. There's been a call for Atmanirbhar Bharat. And I think there are few Indian companies that typify the Atmanirbhar Bharat, made in India formula long before the slogans were coined, such as Bajaj Auto. Today, this idea is being seen as a solution to lifting up the Indian economy post the COVID-19 pandemic. How workable do you think that idea is? And what are the challenges to truly becoming this kind of a company that is an Indian company supplying to the world?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that there's a lot of people who seem to think that Atmanirbhar stands for exclusion. The exclusion of multinational companies or of foreign brands and their products, etc. I personally don't think that is what the Prime Minister meant by Atmanirbhar, or that's what the government of India means by Atmanirbhar. I think what they mean by that is quite simply excellence. And to me, excellence means to be world class, and to be world class means to be global. And that's what we've pursued at Bajaj Auto. 15 years back, we were a company that exported almost nothing. Today, we are a company that exports about half of what it makes under normal circumstances, which means we are a globally competitive company. We call ourselves the world's favorite Indian because we compete successfully in more than 70 countries across the world. So this, to me, is the meaning of Atmanirbhar. And if this is what the government means, then I could not agree with it more. You asked me, what stands in the way of this? Well, at a very fundamental level, what stands in the way of this is simply greed. Companies try to extend the scope of their business, and they try to extend their brands into areas which are not core to them. And by doing so, they diffuse their brand and they dilute their competitiveness. I mean, just to illustrate, let me give you these examples. How absurd does Volvo salt sound to you? Quite absurd, but Tata salt sounds fine, right? How absurd does Jeep holiday resort sound to you? But Mahindra holiday resort sounds fine. How absurd does BMW juicer mixer grinder sound to you? Pretty absurd. But a Bajaj juicer mixer grinder sounds fine. So at the heart of business, your greatest asset is your brand. And if you have to be a global brand, as distinct from a local one, then you need to be very sharp. In other words, the best advice I ever got when we were pursuing a strategy of being globally competitive was narrow your focus. The narrower you are, the sharper you are, the deeper you will go. Because then you have an identity that is clear to everyone. And by doing the same thing again and again, you will probably do it better than anyone else does. Now, every sports person, every artist, every musician, every chef, every doctor understands the virtue of specializing in this fashion. But unfortunately, business people, especially in emerging markets, don't, because the market is so large that while they talk global, unfortunately, they largely act local. And they try to extend and expand their business and their brand to capture as much of the local business as possible. And then this doesn't work. And that is why you may remember that 15 years back, the first thing, the first step on the path to globalization is that of sacrifice. Bajaj had to sacrifice its scooter business in order to put every man, every rupee, and every minute behind its motorcycle business at a time when we were a pygmy in the world of motorcycles, and say to ourselves that one day we will be a force to reckon with as a global motorcycle manufacturer. What are the three most important ingredients, therefore, that has helped us? Well, since the government is fond of acronyms, let me tell you, our secret sauce is called FIT, F-I-T. F stands for a sharp focus. It all starts with a sharp global focus, in our case, to make the best motorcycles in the world. Yes. I stands for a unique idea, a big idea. In our case, as someone actually outside the company articulated recently, Bajaj seems to be able to put together motorcycles that embody European design, Japanese quality, and Indian prices. That may sound simplistic, but it's a very, very powerful idea. I think we do it very well. At one end, we are selling a boxer. Many companies have the ability to demonstrate such versatility. And finally, coming to T, the T stands for an aligned team. Only if we are all making the same movie. And we say to ourselves all the time at Bajaj that we will all make a great bike only if we are all making the same bike. If somebody wants to make a cheap bike, somebody wants to make an expensive bike, somebody wants to make a fast bike, somebody wants to make a high mileage bike, we are not going to make the worst of all worlds.
Bajaj success story is well known. It all started, with the Pulsar. I want to understand from you your view in the current day context. When we say that we want to become Atmanirbhar Bharat, we're speaking about this as a philosophy which goes beyond one company, one sector. What are the hurdles Indian industry faces to achieve that goal?
Okay, let's give them one more acronym to think about. The 4 Ls. The time-honored 4 Ls. We have problems.
I have to ask you, are you coming up with these on the spot? Or have you planned these acronyms?
Why should you feel otherwise? So the time-honored problems have been land. Even today, the acquisition of land is a problem for companies. The second L is labor. There's all sorts of issues we know very well with labor. The third is logistics. Call it infrastructure if you want. I mean, from suppliers through dealers to ports to ships is an ongoing problem. And lastly, legislation. I mean, I just referred to our quadricycle, the Q, a innovation that could have taken the three-wheeler forward, made it safer and greener, was held back for 8 or 10 years. So these are the problems. But what I want to say is this, because I think it's important to put a positive message out. That yes, we are proud of the fact that today we export half of what we make, and very significantly so to developed markets, to the US, to Europe, to UK, to Japan, to Australia. And I think there is a 4-horizon plan that one can put together for this purpose. The first thing we did was to focus on countries in the subcontinent around us, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. Our strategy in one simple word was same. They are very similar markets. You take the same product, same prices, you go there, it works. This is the first step. I think every Indian company can grow its business and be more Atmanirbhar and be more global if it chooses to do this. The second is to go to the continent of Africa. You may be surprised, and you certainly should be proud to know that every third motorcycle sold in Africa is a Bajaj motorcycle. 15 years ago, that was zero. And in Africa, in a simple word, the strategy is the strategy of better, because largely this was a market dominated by the Chinese. And in Bajaj, they found a better product, although one that was a little more expensive, because we can't make it as cheap as the Chinese do, because our quality is at a different level. So that's the second, I think, option that is also available to a lot of Indian companies, and a lot of them are actually leveraging these options towards becoming Atmanirbhar or excellent. The third is when you go to the markets in LATAM and ASEAN, which are dominated by the Japanese. It's not easy to compete in these markets from Brazil and Colombia to Indonesia and Thailand. And here you start competing more on perception than on reality, which means that in terms of what you offer, because you are part of a technologically mature industry, you are unlikely to offer a product which is much superior, but you have to create a perception of being different in the marketplace. How you do that in terms of engineering and marketing determines your success. And finally, when you go to the developed markets that I mentioned, I think in one word, the strategy is to be niche. And that's what we've done with KTM. We are doing that with Husqvarna. Hopefully, we will more than repeat that success with Triumph. And if I may say so, you have to do it very humbly, because your brand is not going to find any traction in those markets. It doesn't matter how good a Casio watch is. It is never an Omega.
The way we will recover and the timeline with which we will recover. We've seen, of course, a massive hit to the economy because of the lockdown. Overall demand is depressed. Do you see demand returning in your space specifically and overall?
Well, I think it's very industry specific. For us, rationally, logically, I would say yes, as a combination of two things. Mainly, one, the suppressed demand of the last 3 months has to come back at some point, sooner rather than later. And secondly, certainly there will be a structural change away from buses and metros and trams or trains or what have you, to motorcycles and to small three-wheelers as opposed to big three-wheelers. So this is going to be a favorable tailwind for a company like Bajaj Auto. On the other hand, as I said in the beginning, there is more than just a flu virus out there. There is a fear virus out there. So how soon will people muster the courage in the face of this pandemic, in anxiety for their jobs or salary cuts? How soon will they find it in themselves to come back? One doesn't know. I think the best thing, the most sensible thing to do is to wait and watch. But I am a believer that coming out of a crisis, it is in the nature of the human being to uplift his mood in some fashion. So I think the recovery is likely to take us by surprise. It is likely to be stronger than expected. And I would certainly like to believe that at least by the second half of the year, we start coming back to a normal level of business.
Do you think there's some things which will change forever? Everyone keeps talking. There are two stark news that I hear very often. One is that soon the COVID-19 pandemic and all of this fear will be behind us at some point. We'll get back to normal. And the other is that some things are going to change forever. Maybe work from home is one of them. Do you think that there has been a paradigm shift in some areas?
Well, in terms of working, I'm a little amused by this because for the last 20 years, I was looking at and listening to stories about the campuses of Google and Apple and Porsche and all these wonderful companies, and looking at the kind of campuses or working infrastructure that they build for their people, so that people want to come to work, and it's so invigorating. It's also so comfortable and convenient, and every possible service you can imagine is available there. And you can get your hair cut, and you can go to the gym, and you can get your stuff laundered, and somebody will go and shop for all of that. And now suddenly we are saying exactly the opposite. I don't buy this, and I don't want to buy this because we just spent a lot of money expanding, rebuilding our campus at Akurdi. It's unfinished because of what happened. So I would very much like to believe that there is a lot of value to getting people to work, to coming together face to face. Human beings are about energy. We are not just, about facts and data and logic. And that energy has to be felt when you're together. So I think at least in our kind of business, except for very few people who are so-called individual performers or specialists, I would like to think that, or I believe that most people need to come back to work. At least most days of the week. In terms of change outside of the business, what Bill Gates said, right? He said in the short term, we overestimate what's possible. In the long term, we underestimate it. So I think in the short term, what is important for a company like us is to make a even sharper proposition to the customer. And what does this mean? It means that in our aspirational brands, like a Pulsar, a Avenger, a Dominar, a KTM, we must make an irresistible value proposition, not by discounting, but by pressing upon the levers of product first and foremost, and communication and price, etc. We must make an irresistible value proposition, but with our aspirational brands. I think this will really get people coming out of the woodworks at double speed. So I think this is one thing which is very important in the short term. I think in the long term, I think this is, this awareness of the environment, etc., and how interdependent our health is with it, is really going to move the electric vehicle movement forward. There's a lot the government has to do in that respect. I think in terms of localization policy, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of battery disposal, etc. So in terms of policy, and they are working on it. I know Niti Aayog is working very vigorously in this direction. And there's a lot like manufacturers like us have to do to put product out there, to educate customers, and to create a market where none exists. So, I think this is a big opportunity for India in the longer term, and we should not underestimate it.
Last question, Mr. Bajaj. What has been your personal learning and eye-opening moment through this lockdown? What are the realizations that you are going to be exiting with?
I think the most important would be how quickly people can adapt when they have to. So otherwise, as managers, we are all about being cautious and measured and step by step in our approach. But when called upon to respond swiftly, we can. I mean, at my level, if I may say so, there is not much that I can do or I did in terms of getting plants started, in terms of getting enabling suppliers, in terms of facilitating dealers. But I have watched in amazement how my senior team and everyone down to the frontline people have used this time, to establish the so-called new normal. So I think this should mean that we all go back with much greater confidence in ourselves, because resources are important. Heritage is important. But nothing is more important than your courage, your confidence, your ability to be resourceful, to be imaginative, to think out of the box. And I think not just industry, I think the people of this country have demonstrated that. And I think that is why we will all come back stronger.
Well, to that optimism and that good note, I would like to thank you for joining us today and for always speaking your mind. We need more of that, not less. That was Rajiv Bajaj for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.